Imagine a city, the size of a small metropolis, complete with its own dedicated power plant, a sprawling airfield, and these intersecting rail lines.
Right.
Now imagine that on official maps, this massive, bustling city simply does not exist.
Like it's just a blank space.
Exactly. And the thousands of highly educated professionals commuting there every single day aren't going to work to build infrastructure or, manufacture consumer goods.
No, definitely not.
They are commuting to a facility disguised under the incredibly boring bureaucratic name of a water purification department.
Which is such a specifically dull name.
Right. But their actual 9-to-5 job was engineering the deadliest plagues known to humanity.
Yeah, I mean, it is a premise that sounds like dystopian fiction, but it is entirely terrifyingly real.
Yeah.
We are looking at a vast secret facility constructed in the 1930s in occupied Manchuria.
And what makes this history so critical to understand isn't just the sheer scale of the operation, right?
No, it's the profound psychological and geopolitical architecture that allowed it to happen, and eventually allowed its architects to walk away completely unscathed.
Which is the part we really need you, our listener, to brace yourself for today. We're taking a deep dive into the historical records of Unit 731, pulling from extensive accounts like Echoes of the Past, the logs.
That's a heavy one.
It really is. We are going to unpack how a modern state built a factory for human experimentation and how a secret bargain with the United States government just, erased that crime from the world stage for decades.
Yeah.
And to really grasp how civilized, oath-taking doctors could participate in this, we have to start with a single highly engineered word.
Right.
The word is maruta.
Maruta, yeah. In Japanese, it translates quite literally to log.
Like timber.
Exactly, like a piece of timber or firewood. Because the facility itself was disguised to the outside local world as a lumber mill.
Wow.
So when the blacked-out transport trucks arrived in the dead of night, the medical staff wouldn't ask how many prisoners or patients had arrived.
They would ask something else.
Right, they would ask how many logs did the mill process today.
It's easy to look at that linguistic trick and dismiss it as a crude insult. But when you look closer at the psychology of it, it wasn't just a slur.
No, not at all.
It was a mechanism.
Yeah.
If you're a trained medical professional, someone who has spent years learning the intricate anatomy of the human body to heal it.
Right, you've taken an oath.
Exactly. Strapping a living, breathing person to a table to perform lethal experiments is going to trigger massive psychological resistance. Conscience is heavy.
It is. The human brain is generally wired for empathy.
Yeah.
But if you linguistically reframe that person, if you mandate from the top down that this breathing human is actually maruta, just raw material, you fundamentally alter your cognitive relationship to the act of killing.
You build a mental firewall.
Precisely. It insulates the perpetrator from the reality of their actions. It reframes torture and murder as mere industrial processing.
It's a chilling concept, and frankly, if you think about it, it's terrifyingly relatable in a much milder modern sense.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about corporate sanitization today. We constantly reduce humans to resources or, human capital or data points to make tough business decisions easier.
Right. Exactly.
When a corporation calls a massive layoff a strategic redundancy optimization, it's a lot easier for an executive to sign that paper than if they had to say, I am taking away the livelihood of 3,000 families.
That is the exact mechanism of cognitive detachment.
Yeah.
And at Unit 731, we see that exact same corporate bureaucratic sanitization applied to an absolute horrifying physical extreme.
Yeah.
By building that linguistic wall, empathy cannot penetrate it. And once that empathy is neutralized, the scale of what a system can accomplish in the dark is practically limitless.
But this brings us to a massive logistical hurdle. I mean, an operation of this magnitude doesn't just spontaneously generate.
No, it takes planning.
Right. A doctor doesn't just wake up one day and decide to build a massive biological death camp. He had to pitch this idea. He had to secure incredible amounts of state funding. So how did this nightmare factory actually get greenlit?
Well, to answer that, we have to trace the dark logic of the man at the center of this, Shirō Ishii.
Okay.
He was an army doctor and a brilliant microbiologist trained at one of Japan's most elite universities.
So he's not a fringe guy.
Not at all. He was top tier. And to understand his pitch, we have to look at the global geopolitical landscape of 1925, specifically the Geneva Protocol.
Right, 1925. So the world is just a few years out from the horrors of the First World War.
Exactly.
The international community is reeling from the unprecedented devastation of industrialized warfare. specifically the use of chemical weapons like mustard gas.
It was fresh in everyone's minds.
So the Geneva Protocol was basically a collective global shudder. It was the nations of the world coming together and explicitly banning the use of biological and chemical weapons in war. It was a line drawn in the sand.
It was intended as an absolute moral boundary. The consensus was that these weapons were simply too cruel, too indiscriminate, and too uncontrollable. But Shirō Ishii looked at the Geneva Protocol, and he interpreted it completely backward.
Wait, backward how?
He did not see a moral boundary. He saw an international endorsement of the weapon's ultimate lethality.
It's like putting a giant, heavy padlock on a cabinet. Most people see the lock and think, keep out. This is off limits.
Right.
Ishii saw the lock and thought, whatever is hidden inside there is so unimaginably powerful, I need to own it before my enemies figure out how to pick the lock. He saw the global terror as a proof of concept.
That is exactly it. His logic was ruthlessly pragmatic. He figured if the greatest military powers on Earth are so terrified of germ warfare that they feel the need to universally outlaw it, then it must be extraordinarily effective.
Wow.
I mean, why ban a weapon that doesn't work?
From a purely psychopathic standpoint, it makes sense.
Yeah, and this inverted logic perfectly matched the hunger of the Japanese military establishment at the time. Following the 1931 invasion of Manchuria, Japan was an empire on a rapid, aggressive expansion.
Right, they were stretched thin.
Very. They were desperate for any asymmetrical advantage to maintain their hold over vast new territories and prepare for total war.
And Ishii walks into the room with the ultimate pitch. He sells biological warfare not just as a devastating tool, but as cheap. He called it the poor nation's weapon.
That is the crux of why he received such lavish funding. If you want to build a fleet of tanks or a squadron of bombers, you need massive foundries, tons of steel, rubber, oil, and a massive industrial base.
A huge economy.
Right. But a pathogen breeds itself.
Oh, man.
It is a self-replicating weapon. For an expanding empire looking to maximize mass casualties while minimizing industrial cost, Ishii's proposal wasn't just intriguing, it was irresistible.
But wait, let me stop you there.
Yeah.
Because reading through the historical context, Japan wasn't the only nation curious about biological weapons.
No, they weren't.
The United States and Britain were absolutely researching them too. So why did Japan's program accelerate so far past the Allies into this realm of unimaginable horror?
The difference was a very specific ethical boundary. Researchers in the United States and Britain were constrained by an ethical line that restricted their biological weapons testing strictly to animals.
Okay.
They were preparing for the theoretical possibility of a biological war, but they were not legally or culturally willing to cross the threshold into mass human experimentation.
Whereas Ishii
faced absolutely no such constraint.
because of Manchuria.
Exactly. The occupation of Manchuria provided him with something no other microbiologist in the world had: a captive, occupied populace that his government essentially deemed subhuman. He was given a completely free hand and unlimited state resources to use them as his personal petri dish.
Which raises this incredibly bleak question about the nature of innovation itself. We're taught to revere scientific progress as inherently noble.
Usually, yes.
But when you take a brilliant scientific mind, strip away every single ethical constraint, and back them with the unlimited checkbook of a militarized state,
It gets dark fast.
intelligence and scientific rigor just become a highly efficient engine for destruction.
It proves that science is just a tool, completely agnostic to morality. Without an ethical framework, innovation simply accelerates the capacity for cruelty.
Yeah.
And that acceleration required physical space. Ishii couldn't test these self-replicating weapons on humans in a basement lab in Tokyo. He needed a dedicated environment.
Which brings us to the physical manifestation of Ishii's terrifying vision, the facility at Pingfang.
Right.
This is the hidden city we talked about at the top of the show, located near Harbin in occupied Manchuria. And the scale of this place is just staggering. It was several square kilometers of absolute autonomous control.
The infrastructure really reveals the depth of the state's commitment. This
Yeah.
wasn't a rogue operation hidden in a cave.
No.
This was a state-of-the-art complex featuring multiple sprawling laboratories, extensive barracks to house thousands of personnel, its own dedicated rail connection for supplies and transport, an airfield, and a massive tower plant to keep the incinerators and refrigeration units running 24/7.
It was an autonomous state within a state.
Literally.
And yet they slapped this incredibly boring sign on the front gate, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army.
It's so cynical.
It really is. It provides this veneer of respectable humanitarian bureaucracy. If you look at it on paper, you think, oh, these are dedicated public health scientists making sure the troops have clean drinking water and don't get cholera.
It's the ultimate camouflage. But the reality inside was explicitly the opposite.
Yeah.
And we know this because of the records of the opening ceremony.
Read the speech.
Yes. When the facility was completed, Shirō Ishii stood in front of his assembled staff, a massive crowd of educated, highly trained medical professionals, and he didn't sugarcoat what they were about to do.
Unbelievable.
He explicitly told them that they were there to invert the medical oath. He acknowledged that a doctor's true calling is to cure disease, but he informed them their duty to the empire was the exact reverse. They were there to research how to weaponize disease to kill as many human beings as possible.
Okay, if you're listening to this and wondering how on earth an entire staff of educated doctors didn't mutiny right then and there, you aren't alone.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
I really struggle with the logistics of human behavior here. These are people who spent a decade learning how to heal. Your boss stands up and officially tells you to break the fundamental foundation of your civilized profession.
Yeah.
How does that not result in immediate mass desertion?
It forces us to look deeply at the psychology of state-sanctioned permission. When the absolute highest authorities in your society, the military, the government, the emperor's representatives, tell you that a profound wrong is actually a necessary right, an individual's moral compass can easily shatter.
It's like the Stanford prison experiment,
Yeah,
but on a macro national scale, with unlimited funding and real scalpels.
precisely. And the historical accounts outline a complex web of motivations for these doctors. For some, it was raw, pragmatic ambition.
Just career climbers.
Yes. Pingfang was a cutting-edge facility with unlimited resources. Working there guaranteed career advancement and prestige within the medical community.
Right.
For others, it was extreme nationalism, a genuine belief that they were securing the survival of their empire against foreign threats.
And I imagine fear played a massive role as well. I mean, if you're standing in that crowd and you say, actually, I won't do this, you aren't just fired.
No, you're a traitor.
You're a traitor to the military.
Fear of execution or reprisal against their families was certainly present, but we also have to confront the darkest motivation of all,
Which is?
the sheer, intoxicating allure of absolute permission.
Oh, man.
There is a terrifying subset of human psychology that, when given total, unquestioned power over a vulnerable group and legally absolved of all consequences, will explore the absolute limits of cruelty just to see what happens. The state removed all boundaries.
And the result of removing those boundaries was a highly sophisticated industrial machine built for one single purpose,
Yeah.
to process those logs. Which means we have to confront who these victims actually were and the terrifying, paradoxical system they were forced into.
The victims were systematically stripped of their names and identities, and the perpetrators worked very hard at the end of the war to burn the records and keep them nameless.
Right.
But through painstaking archival work, fragmented transport logs have revealed the demographics.
They were overwhelmingly Chinese civilians and captured resistance fighters. But the records also show Russians, Koreans, Mongolians, and Allied prisoners of war.
Yeah.
And we aren't just talking about captured enemy combatants holding rifles. The demographics include men, women, the elderly, children, infants, and pregnant women.
The occupation forces were rounding up anyone deemed disposable, the homeless, the poor, people arrested on entirely vague or fabricated charges.
Souped off the street.
Exactly. They were the most vulnerable members of society. And the logistics of bringing them to Pingfang were designed for maximum secrecy. They arrived at night in completely blacked out trucks. Even the local population living directly outside the compound walls had absolutely no idea what the facility truly held.
But once they were inside those walls, the victims were subjected to a system that I can only describe as a horrifying clinical paradox. We think of a death camp as a place of starvation and immediate brutality.
Sure, like the images we typically see.
Right. But the records show that at Pingfang, healthy prisoners were often kept incredibly well fed. They were given good diets and kept in peak physical condition, not out of mercy, but for purely scientific reasons.
This is where we see the absolute cold weaponization of the scientific method. To understand why they kept them healthy, you have to understand the biology of experimentation.
Okay, unpack that.
If you want to accurately measure how a new, highly virulent strain of plague ravages the human body, you need a clean baseline.
I see.
If your test subject is already starving or suffering from dysentery or has a compromised immune system from physical abuse, the data you collect on the plague's progression is corrupted. You won't know if the pathogen killed them or if the starvation killed them.
It is the weaponization of care. You enter a facility, men in white coats check your vitals, they ensure you're perfectly nourished and physically robust.
Yes.
But the ultimate goal of all that meticulous medical attention is a guaranteed, agonizing death. They were treating human beings exactly the way a modern laboratory treats sterile Petri dishes or specially bred, pathogen-free lab mice.
The mortality rate reflects that institutionalized lethality. The survival rate was exactly 0.
0.
Over 3,000 people are estimated to have been murdered inside the walls of Pingfang alone. And the methods used were designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance under various biological and physical stresses.
The records outline deliberate infection with devastating diseases, subjecting victims to extreme cold, to steady frostbite and gangrene, placing them in pressure chambers until their organs ruptured, and performing live surgeries, vivisections without anesthesia to observe internal disease progression in real time.
It's horrific.
It really is. But I want to be careful here because we aren't going to spend the next 20 minutes itemizing every single gruesome detail of those surgeries.
And there is a very important analytical reason for that restraint. When we fixate endlessly on the graphic, visceral mechanics of torture, we risk turning a massive historical tragedy into a form of horror tourism.
Right, it becomes about the shock value of the gore rather than the structural evil that allowed it to happen.
Exactly. The story of Unit 731 isn't just that horrific torture occurred. It is about the systemic, bureaucratic weaponization of medicine by a modern nation-state.
Yeah.
By focusing on the structure of the crime, the funding, the logistics, the clinical detachment, we maintain our focus on the true danger. How easily institutions can completely abandon their morality.
It honors the victims more to focus on the massive injustice of the system that erased them, rather than just cataloging their physical agony. And speaking of erasing them, the archivist's work you mentioned earlier, history relies on a paper trail. When Shirō Ishii's men eventually burned those records, they were essentially trying to murder these victims a second time. They wanted to wipe their very existence from human memory.
Which is why the work of those archivists over the decades is a profound form of resistance.
Absolutely.
When a state attempts total historical erasure, the agonizingly slow process of recovering a single name from a charred transport log is a massive victory. It is the restoration of human identity to someone who was systematically reduced to a piece of timber.
But everything we've talked about so far, the compound, the experiments, the logs, all of this horror, was just the research and development phase.
That's the scariest part.
The ultimate goal of Pingfang wasn't to write medical papers in secret. It was military application in the real world, which means we have to look at what happened when the weapon finally left the laboratory.
The transition from controlled, isolated experiments within a compound to the indiscriminate mass murder of civilian populations in the field.
The historical records confirm that these biological weapons were actively used during Japan's war in China. They seeded entire populated areas, cities, and rural villages with devastating diseases, like bubonic plague and cholera.
Yes, they did.
But how do you actually deploy a plague? You can't just drop a glass vial out of a plane.
No, and this is where the engineering of the weapon becomes terrifyingly sophisticated. Ishii's team developed porcelain bombs.
Porcelain bombs, like ceramics.
Exactly, because a standard metal bomb generates massive heat and explosive force on impact, which would instantly incinerate the biological agents inside.
Oh, right. The heat would sterilize the bomb.
Precisely. But a porcelain bomb packed with plague-infected fleas and a small detonating charge would shatter at a specific altitude, safely dispersing a massive cloud of infected vectors over a wide area.
Wow.
They also poisoned wells, distributed infected food like wheat, and intentionally released infected animals into agricultural zones.
Just imagine the sheer terror of being in one of those targeted rural villages. You have no idea what Unit 731 is. You've never heard of Pingfang or Shirō Ishii.
You're just a farmer.
Right. You're hundreds of miles away from this hidden city. And suddenly, your community is struck by an entirely unnatural, devastating outbreak of bubonic plague. Your home has unknowingly become a distant, open-air laboratory for men looking through microscopes, hundreds of miles away.
And this highlights the fundamentally uncontrollable, insidious nature of biological warfare, which is exactly why the global community tried to ban it in 1925.
Right.
Unlike a conventional bomb, which has a defined blast radius and a specific moment of destruction, a biological weapon does not respect borders. It doesn't respect peace treaties. A pathogen doesn't stop multiplying just because a surrender document has been signed on a battleship.
The casualties from these field attacks numbered in the tens of thousands dead, and potentially far higher due to the difficulty of tracking the outbreaks. But the lingering effects are what really emphasize your point.
Yeah, it didn't just end with the war.
Disease outbreaks continued to ravage the Harbin area and other regions for years after the war had officially ended.
The legacy of Unit 731 literally seeped into the environment. The biological agents they unleashed became endemic.
Like a permanent scar.
Exactly. They lived on in the soil, in the local water tables, and in the regional flea and rodent populations, continuing to kill civilians long after the perpetrators had packed up their laboratories and gone home.
But this raises a massive logical question for me. The entire point of Ping Fang was secrecy. The blacked-out trucks, the fake cover names, the isolated compound.
Total secrecy, yes.
If secrecy was paramount, how did they think they could actively deploy these weapons in the open against civilian populations without exposing the existence of the program to the entire world? It seems like a massive risk.
It was a risk born of absolute brazen hubris. They were operating with a profound belief in their own impunity.
Like they were untouchable.
Right. Firstly, they calculated that the fog of war, combined with the general chaos and lack of medical infrastructure in an occupied, war-torn territory, would mask the precise origin of the outbreaks.
Oh, I see.
Who could definitively prove it was a weapon and not just a natural epidemic.
Plausibility, deniability.
But more importantly, it reveals an arrogant certainty that they were going to win the war. And as the victors, they would write history. They fundamentally believe they would never, ever be held accountable by an outside authority.
But that absolute arrogance evaporated on a very specific day in August 1945.
It sure did.
When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Soviet tanks rolled across the border into Manchuria, driving straight toward Harbin, the clinical detachment inside Ping Fang turned into frantic, chaotic panic.
The transition from total hubris to absolute panic is a pivotal moment in this history. The staff at Unit 731 suddenly realized that the empire had fallen, the war was lost, and the physical evidence of their unimaginable crimes was sitting right there for the advancing Allied and Soviet forces to find.
And they understood exactly what that evidence meant for their own necks. So direct orders came down from Tokyo, destroy everything.
Burn it all down.
A frantic, meticulous cover-up began. They burned the vast archives of records. They rigged the massive state-of-the-art laboratory buildings with explosives and blew them up, though some were built so solidly that the concrete ruins still stand today as a haunting memorial.
But the most horrific aspect of the cover-up was the sanitization of the crime scene regarding the living evidence.
Prisoners.
Yes. To ensure there were absolutely no witnesses who could testify to what had happened inside those walls, the staff systematically murdered every single remaining prisoner. It was a final act of mass execution committed not for research, but purely for bureaucratic self-preservation.
And Shirō Ishii himself, the architect of this entire nightmare, gives his men a final explicit instruction. Disappear. Tell no one. Take this secret to the grave.
Yeah.
He handed out cyanide capsules to his staff in case they were captured, ordered them to blend back into civilian life, and he even temporarily faked his own death, holding a mock funeral to slip away into the shadows.
He built a machine that murdered thousands, and when the bill finally came due, he attempted to quietly walk out the back door of history.
But he doesn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, U.S. occupation forces in Japan discover that Ishii is, in fact, alive.
They find him.
And here is where the story takes a turn that is just, it induces a kind of moral whiplash. Because the obvious immediate next step is a military tribunal and a war crimes trial, right?
Based on every historical and legal precedent being established at that exact moment, yes.
Right.
But instead of being met by military prosecutors or human rights investigators, Ishii was interrogated by biological warfare researchers from the United States military.
Just scientists talking to scientists.
Exactly. And Ishii, who was above all things a ruthless pragmatist, saw an opportunity and made an offer. The deal. Ishii offered to hand over everything. He offered his notebooks, the data, the pathogen strains, the slides, everything his program had supposedly learned from a decade of torturing thousands of human beings to death.
And what did he want for it?
In exchange for this treasure trove of biological intelligence, he demanded total sweeping immunity from prosecution for himself and every single one of his subordinates. No war crimes trials, no public exposure, no punishments.
Wait, hold on. Let's really look at this. You're telling me the highest levels of the U.S. command knew they were dealing with the architects of mass civilian murder and lethal human experimentation,
Yeah.
and they just gave them a pass.
They gave them a pass.
How was that even justified internally? Was there no pushback?
To understand how this happened, we have to look impartially at the intense geopolitical calculations of the moment.
Okay.
The United States was looking past the end of World War II and staring directly at the impending Cold War with the Soviet Union. The primary motivation for the U.S. command wasn't just acquiring the data for themselves.
It was keeping it from the Soviets.
Exactly. It was actively keeping that data out of the hands of the advancing Soviets. They viewed biological warfare as a potential existential threat in the coming conflict.
But the contrast here is just staggering. At the exact same time, this secret backroom deal is being struck in Tokyo to protect Ishii. You have the Nuremberg trials happening in Europe.
It's a crazy parallel.
Nazi doctors who committed highly comparable medical atrocities in concentration camps are being put on trial in front of the entire world. Some are being hanged.
Right.
The Nuremberg trials are literally establishing the Nuremberg Code, which becomes the absolute bedrock of modern medical ethics and informed consent.
The dichotomy between Nuremberg and Tokyo is one of the most profound ethical fractures in modern history. In Europe, the Allies chose public accountability.
Yeah.
They realized that to rebuild a moral world, the crimes had to be exposed, and a framework for the future of medicine had to be established.
But in Japan,
But in Japan, Unit 731 was entirely meticulously walled off from the Tokyo war crimes trials. The U.S. government weighed the moral imperative of justice for the victims against the strategic asset of biological data, and they made a quiet, bureaucratic decision that the data was simply more valuable.
it's as if a prosecutor cornered a notorious, incredibly prolific serial killer. And instead of putting him in handcuffs, the prosecutor lets him walk entirely free, changes his identity, and gives him a pension just to get his secret diary of how he committed the crimes.
That's exactly what it was like.
But the absolute bitter irony of this entire bargain, and this is the part that truly exposes the folly of the whole deal, is what the U.S. scientists actually found when they opened that diary.
Yes, this brings us to the profound scientific fallacy at the very heart of the bargain.
The U.S. traded the foundational concept of justice for this data, believing it would be an incredible cutting-edge military asset. But when they finally analyzed Ishii's records, they realized the data was practically worthless. Why?
It exposes a fundamental flaw in how both Ishii and the U.S. officials viewed human biology.
Okay.
They falsely assumed that extreme cruelty somehow yields profound, hidden scientific insights that ethical science cannot reach.
Like it's some sort of forbidden knowledge.
Right, but from a purely biological standpoint, it is entirely flawed. When a human being is subjected to agonizing torture, live vivisection, or extreme terror, their body does not remain at a normal baseline.
Right, the body reacts to the trauma.
Exactly. Massive trauma triggers a catastrophic endocrine response. Cortisol levels spike astronomically. The adrenal system overloads. The immune system completely collapses under the stress.
So they aren't normal subjects anymore.
Not at all. Therefore, if you are trying to meticulously measure the progression of a disease in that tortured body, your data is completely corrupted. You aren't observing how a pathogen acts in a normal, healthy population.
Right.
You are observing a biological system actively shutting down under catastrophic, unnatural duress. The physiological stress of the torture ruined the very data they were trying to collect.
So the information was messy, unscientific, and fundamentally flawed. The United States sold out international justice, let the architects of biological holocaust walk completely free, and in return, they got a stack of useless paper. It's an illusion.
And the implications of that illusion are devastating. It fractured the foundation of international post-war justice.
Yeah.
I mean, what message did it send to the world when the Nuremberg Code, this great beacon of global medical ethics, turned out to be geographically selective?
It means it's not really a rule.
It introduced a deep cynicism into the post-war order, suggesting that human rights are not absolute moral imperatives, but rather negotiable commodities. If the geopolitical stakes are deemed high enough, the rules simply do not apply.
And because the rules didn't apply, because of this secret bureaucratic bargain, the men of Unit 731 didn't just escape the hangman's noose. They didn't just vanish into obscurity or live in hiding.
No, they didn't
They
know.
walked right back into the daylight and into the upper echelons of post-war society.
The post-war reality for the perpetrators is perhaps the most chilling chapter of this entire history because of its sheer normalcy.
Let's look at Shirō Ishii's fate.
Mm.
He didn't die in a cold prison cell. He didn't face a firing squad or a tribunal.
Mm?
According to the historical records, he died a completely free man, sleeping in his own bed in 1959 of throat cancer at the age of 67. He was never punished. Not once.
And the fate of his vast network of subordinates is equally disturbing. The men who operated the facility, the doctors who viewed human beings as disposable logs and performed vivisections, thrived in post-war Japan.
Sickening.
Because the United States had guaranteed their immunity and kept their names out of the Tokyo trials, they were free to seamlessly reintegrate into public life.
The records list their post-war careers, and it's almost impossible to process. These men became highly respected university professors teaching the next generation of doctors.
Yes.
They became directors of major hospitals. They became wealthy pharmaceutical executives. One prominent member became the head of a national medical association.
It goes all the way to the top.
Another was elected the governor of Tokyo. Another became the head of the country's Olympic Committee.
We have to seriously consider the terrifying reality of a society operating with these men at the helm. The individuals who systematically murdered thousands went on to dictate public health policy, direct medical research, and influence education in a modern democratic nation.
Wow.
The institutional knowledge of their crimes didn't die with the war. It simply put on a suit and sat quietly in boardrooms, in lecture halls, and in government offices for decades.
How does an entire society function when the people running its hospitals and pharmaceutical companies are secretly the architects of a biological holocaust?
It takes a lot of effort.
It means the society is functioning directly on top of a massive, unexploded bomb of historical truth. It requires a massive, collective, enforced silence.
A joint erasure engineered by both the Japanese and American governments. As the records show, this entire chapter of history was meticulously left out of Japanese textbooks for generations. The survivors of the field attacks in China were ignored. There were no official apologies and absolutely no compensation.
But I want to clarify something, because while the Tokyo trials ignored this, there actually was one trial, right? Just not in the West.
That is correct. In 1949, the Soviet Union held a war crimes trial in the city of Khabarovsk.
Okay.
They had captured several members of the Kwantung Army, including some who had worked at Pingfang. They tried and convicted a dozen members of the unit, featuring explicit testimonies about the biological weapons and the human experiments, and sentenced them to labor camps.
But the West completely dismissed this trial. They literally called it communist propaganda. Why?
Here, we must impartially break down the deep Cold War dynamics at play. The United States had already committed to the cover-up to secure the biological data and protect Ishii's network.
Right, they had made their bed.
Exactly. Acknowledging the validity of the Soviet trial in Khabarovsk would have required the U.S. to publicly admit that Unit 731 existed.
Oh, I see.
And by extension, it would have exposed America's own complicity in sheltering the primary architects of the program. So, dismissing the detailed confessions at the Khabarovsk trial as mere Soviet propaganda was a necessary, calculated geopolitical maneuver by the West to protect their own secret bargain.
It's layers upon layers of international cover-up. But as history constantly proves, an atrocity of this sheer magnitude cannot stay buried forever. The truth is too heavy. The long silence eventually began to crack.
Beginning in the 1980s, the institutional silence began to fracture. Persistent investigative journalists, dedicated historians, and eventually some of the aging former members of the unit themselves, heavily burdened by decades of guilt, began to speak out and publicly confess to what they had done.
It took decades of relentless pressure, but eventually there was a legal milestone. In 2002, a Japanese court formally acknowledged that the biological warfare and the atrocities had in fact occurred.
That was huge.
They finally admitted the history on the official record. Although, tellingly, the court still denied the Chinese victims any financial compensation, citing complex international treaties. The truth was finally admitted, but restitution was still denied.
It is a partial, fractured victory for historical truth, but a continued denial of material justice. However, amidst all the institutional maneuvering, the historical accounts provide a deeply poignant example of individual conscience finally breaking through the state-mandated silence.
Yes, the story of the teenage apprentice. This specific account really struck me as the emotional core of the aftermath.
It really puts things in perspective.
The records describe an old man who, as a young boy during the war, had worked at Pingfang. He was just an apprentice, tending the animals, sweeping floors, and only slowly coming to understand what was really happening in the laboratories around him.
Right.
Decades later, near the very end of his life, he traveled back to the site in Harbin, China, which is now a memorial. And he stood there, he bowed deeply, he apologized, and he publicly called himself an aggressor.
We must contrast that moment with Shirō Ishii. Ishii, the mastermind who orchestrated the deaths of thousands, died peacefully in his bed, completely unrepentant and protected by a global superpower.
Yeah.
But a man who was merely a boy sweeping the floors carried the immense crushing burden of that guilt for nearly his entire life. It highlights a vital truth about history. While states, courts, and institutions can mandate secrecy, forge immunity deals, and enforce silence, individual human conscience often outlasts state secrecy.
The ruins of Pingfang still stand today. They are now a museum, a place dedicated to memory. But memory is exactly what the creators of this facility and the bureaucrats who protected them tried so desperately to obliterate. Which brings us to what we ultimately take away from all this.
The conclusion we must draw from this complex history is multifaceted. It isn't just a story about a few evil men.
Right. It's too easy to look at this and just say Shirō Ishii was a monster.
Yeah.
He was, but history is full of sociopaths with grand ambitions. The deeper, more systemic horror is the ordinary, reasonable, suit-wearing officials, both in Japan and the United States, who looked at an absolute nightmare and made a practical bureaucratic decision to trade justice for an asset.
This is the logic of the useful atrocity. We must deeply reflect on how easily justice is set aside when it becomes politically or strategically inconvenient.
Yeah.
The quiet bureaucratic willingness to look at a staggering crime against humanity and ask, how can we use this to our advantage? It's a recurring, dangerous echo in history. It happened here with Unit 731. It happened with Operation Paperclip when scientists were brought west from Nazi Germany. And that utilitarian logic remains a constant temptation for powerful nations today.
And the only counterweight to that systemic erasure is the incredibly fragile mechanism of historical truth. We can't rely on governments or international courts to automatically do the right thing because this history clearly shows they often don't.
No, they act in their own interest.
The preservation of truth relies entirely on individuals. Historians who refuse to stop digging through archives. Journalists who publish the uncomfortable facts. Survivors who bravely refuse to be silenced. And even remorseful perpetrators who finally decide to speak.
They are the only reason we aren't completely ignorant of this story today.
It's a testament to the resilience of truth, yes. But it must also serve as a stark, permanent warning about how easily that truth can be suppressed by those in power when it serves their interests.
Very well said.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. A concept that builds on everything we've uncovered in these records. The history shows that Ishii told his men to take the secret to the grave, and the U.S. government effectively helped them try to do exactly that.
They did.
But think about what it means for the future of medicine and for the fabric of our society when memory itself is treated as a liability.
That's a profound thought.
If the very institutions we are supposed to trust to heal us and protect us, our governments, our top-tier universities, our international medical boards, were historically willing to permanently erase the existence of thousands of victims just to secure a perceived military edge, how can we ever fully, blindly trust institutional memory today?
It is a powerful and deeply necessary question to carry forward. When institutions fail to remember or actively choose to forget, the burden of memory falls entirely on the individual.
The final defense against atrocity isn't a piece of paper signed in Geneva, and it isn't a post-war courtroom. It's the individual's stubborn refusal to let a human being be classified and forgotten as a piece of timber. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take this with you. A truth is always worth the trouble of remembering.